This podcast is an affiliate of BCW Supplies. The next time you need to restock on comic book bags, boards, boxes, and more, be sure to use promo code FSP to save 10% on your order. That's FSP for Flat Squirrel Productions. It helps support the show, too. In 1986, Clark Kent's comic book history as Superboy was erased with the Man of Steel reboot for the post-crisis era. Then, in 2006, after another crisis, Clark's role as a costumed Boy of Steel was reinstated and explored over a little-remembered animated series and a quartet of comic book storylines from writer Geoff Johns. By 2011, the New 52 relaunch would erase Clark's Superboy once again, but for half a decade, Superboy was back. This is the Superboy Returns trilogy. Welcome to Digging for Kryptonite, a Superboy fan journey. I'm your host, Anthony Desiato. Joining me to discuss Superman Secret Origin by Geoff Johns and Gary Frank is the owner of Acme Comics in Greensboro, North Carolina, Lord Retail himself, returning guest Jermaine Exum. Welcome.
Hello, Anthony. I never want to miss an opportunity to talk with you about comics, about any comics at all. And sometimes we even record the conversation, for everyone to listen to.
Yeah, it's always great to speak with you on or off mic, and this is a big episode. They all are in their own way, but Secret Origin is something that I know I have a lot to say about, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts as well. So much to unpack, as there typically is, but man, let me just toss it to you first. This 6-issue miniseries, published from 2009 to 2010, what has your relationship with this work been over the years? It's 15 years now.
I had to dig this one up, both mentally and in my collection as well. This is a story I have not thought about very much over those 15 years. It has rarely entered into my mind, nor has it, for a few reasons, come up as a recommendation. So nothing against the story, but like when you said you wanted to do this one, I was genuinely a little surprised. But then you're being very thorough, shall we say? You're being very thorough. So of course this would come up.
Yeah, why wouldn't we do this?
Well, not that you wouldn't do it, but like dedicate a specific, let's look at this one. I recall, the fan and reader in me disconnected from this story pretty quickly. When I saw that this was happening, that it appeared to be the return of the Superboy concept, which was important to me. Whereas you and I both, being somewhat close in age, went by the post-crisis John Byrne Man of Steel. Superboy was not a thing for this character. Didn't happen that way. You can mention it from time to time, but that is not a thing for this character. I kind of held on to that, whereas I think you held on to it a little bit longer than I did. Or rather, I went backwards to look at Silver Age comics to get my Superboy from there. Adventure Comics, Superboy and the Legion, that I would gain an appreciation for Superboy there as an idea versus it just being this weird concept that you would look at the covers of old comics. And you're like, what is that supposed to be? What is that? So I'm getting this thing I wanted back. Looking at it now, I wonder if it was too little too late at that time in 2009 to do this thing, because it seemed to be happening in a vacuum. For no reason, here's this thing.
Wait, that's the way it felt to you?
That's how it felt to me. That it wasn't. Was it immediately after a crisis or anything? Had something happened to necessitate this? I don't recall.
Well, yeah, this was the official post-Infinite Crisis telling of the origin. This is an interesting aspect when we talk about the timing and the context, and so I'm glad you brought this up because I wanted to hit on this. This was published, again, in 2009, 2010. Infinite Crisis, we're back in 2006. However, towards the end of Infinite Crisis, and we talked about this last week, you have the formation of New Earth, and we have these shards of the new continuity that we see. And one of them is Clark as Superboy. And then over the next few years, we get that Geoff Johns Legion trilogy that we talked about last week, the Lightning Saga, Superman and the Legion of Superheroes, Legion of Three Worlds. So 3 stories over 3-ish years, right, leading up to Secret Origin that do reestablish that Clark had been Superboy. Again, not a publicly, globally known Superboy, but more of this suburban myth who also flew around with the Legion of Superheroes in the future. But that was reestablished there. So then we get to the point of Secret Origin in 2009, 2010 that, I don't know, formalizes it, shows us that origin in and of itself, right, in a standalone story. But again, all of the pieces of it, or most of the pieces of it, right, had already been put into place. And I say all of that to say that even though this wasn't until 2009, 2010, like, it was already in effect, essentially, I feel, as early as the end of Infinite Crisis, certainly by the time we get to that Geoff Johns trilogy. So to me, it always felt like it came much earlier than the actual publication date, which feeds into some of the frustration that I have with it. But so again, I mean, I don't look at it as in a vacuum. I think it really kind of formalizes what Johns had already been doing with that Legion work. And this was also around the time of that 2-year New Krypton saga in the Superman titles, where General Sam Lane functioned as a primary antagonist, and you see him reestablished in that vein in Secret Origin. So I think that's an instance where you saw them really trying to tee up something that was going on in the current books. Not unlike what Johns did with Green Lantern Secret Origin. I think that one might have had even more ties to what he was seeding for the future of that title. But if nothing else, you have the Sam Lane piece of it. So, I don't look at it so much as in a vacuum. It did kind of, to me, it felt like, kind of in keeping with what Johns was doing at the time.
I think, yes, within that Johns context, but, and I don't remember the timetable of conclusion of Crisis on Infinite Earths and when Man of Steel came out, but it just seemed like, yes, you do have that tease, but then it kind of felt like this needed to be ready to roll like pretty quickly, not X number of years later, but this Superman Secret Origin, that kind of need to be ready to roll after Infinite Crisis. Because you've got that weekly churn for people to kind of forget, oh, this was a thing.
No, I don't think that's unfair. And that's actually one of the questions I posed to Chris last week. And we talked about it a little bit of like, yeah, should this have come right after Infinite Crisis? I do think that there's an argument for that. But obviously that's not the way we went, right? We saw these flashbacks to and discussions of Clark's time as Superboy. So we knew that had been a reestablished part of the character's history in the post-Infinite Crisis landscape, even if it took a few years until we got this official Superman Secret Origin miniseries. It was a 6-parter. I'm assuming people who are listening to this are probably familiar with it, have probably read the story. But just to kind of give everyone a little bit of an overview of it, the first 2 issues show Clark as an adolescent in Smallville. We see him learn his alien origins, meet a young Lex Luthor, save Lana from a tornado, don the Superboy garb reluctantly. He's embarrassed by it.
Just like in A Christmas Story, that scene, totally intentional.
And we see him recruited by the Legion of Superheroes and have an adventure with them in the future that allows him to embrace the Superboy side of himself in a way that he wasn't previously. And though we don't see the character on panel, we do also get the arrival of Crypto. So those are some of the highlights, I would say, of those first couple of issues, really showing Clark as this Superboy in Smallville. Issues 3 through 6 then shift the action to an adult Clark arriving in Metropolis, getting his job at the Daily Planet, meeting Lois and Perry and Jimmy, saving Lois, making his public debut, fighting Parasite, and then contending with Lex, who has correctly theorized that Superman is an alien, and he is sort of fanning the flames of anti-Superman, anti-alien sentiment, particularly among the U.S. military, led by General Sam Lane. And so we have Superman battling John Corbin in the Metallo armor, and then later full-on Metallo when he becomes the Metallo that we know. And in the end, essentially winning over the people of Metropolis through his actions in that battle with Metallo in the streets. So that's kind of a general overview of that miniseries. So one of the things we always joke about with you, Jermaine, is that you can be cryptic at times, and sometimes we could talk for hours, and I still don't know like if you liked something or not. So again, having just reread this miniseries, I mean, do you like it? Like, is this something that now you think you would be quicker to show to people if it ever comes back in print, which is a separate issue?
Well, I would if I could, but this story, and let's not assume that everybody read this one. I really feel like this one kind of fell through the cracks on some people. I really think it did. Right now, this story is available in print form in the Absolute Superman by Geoff Johns hardcover slipcase edition. That's where this is available, which is very unfortunate. We're in a time period right now where a lot of material is out of print from DC that you would think would be perennial evergreen graphic novel sellers, but that's not the case. They're out of print. They might come back around again. They will go out of print again. Really put stores in a position to have to front load, some bestsellers to make sure we have access to them when we need them. So it puts a lot of pressure on stores. I did like this story. I will tell you this: I would have never reread this thing had you not presented me with it. I would never have considered rereading this one because I was reminded that this story did not give me what I wanted. The first 2 issues gave me what I wanted. Issue 3 is an immediate and instant time jump into a zone that not that I'd seen the letter of it before, because that's not what I'm saying, but kind of seen that before. What I hadn't seen is the Superboy of Smallville and how did that play out. We got, as you said, you've got Luthor there, which Luthor is very one-dimensional in this entire story. He's very one-dimensional. He's on message. He's also very one-dimensional to where he's just drawn to be excessively evil. Just like the way he's drawn, this guy is evil looking. And that could be tapping into the old comics of it all, perhaps, that he is your bad guy. But he is so... There are points where I'm wondering, why is he even speaking to Clark Kent? Or is he just talking to himself at certain points? So you've got that. You really get a good vibe of the Kents, which is good people raising this young man who's going through some growing pains, and they're helping him navigate a lot of stuff, including the fact that he is not from Earth, and he's going to be having some abilities that no one else has. They're helping him navigate all those things. And as you said, you get a little taste of crypto. But I was hoping to stick around in Smallville a little bit longer, because there's a lot of content that's there, not just the Legion, but it was great to see that. And it was also topical, as you said at the time, to really showcase the Legion, who they were, what their role was with Superman. But we didn't even... It felt like there was more to do there. And we immediately, in issue 3 of a 6-part series, jump years ahead.
Okay, so here's my hot take. I've been thinking about this a lot. This should have been Superboy Secret Origin. That's what this story should have been, because that's what Geoff Johns had to say that was new and additive. Of course, Clark had been Superboy in pre-crisis continuity, but we had not seen this spun in the modern era. And that's where I felt like there was new ground to cover, or a new spin to put on something, versus what we get in the latter 2/3 of this. So that's my hot take. Let me go to a patron question here that's going to tee us up even more. This is from our pal Rick. Rick says, while Secret Origin isn't my favorite of Origins, it's still a solid read and the art is phenomenal. I know I've heard you in the past talk about it, and I believe you weren't the biggest fan of that series, and will be interesting to see if your thoughts have changed on it. So yes, those who have been following this podcast know I've had a little bit of an axe to grind with Superman Secret Origin over the years, and the reasons I think have been twofold. One, and yes, this part has changed a lot, but number one is that at the time, this child of the post-crisis era was really not on board with the reintroduction of certain pre-crisis elements, notably here, the fact that Clark had been Superboy, albeit a Superboy who operated in secret. So it's not quite the pre-crisis version, but he's still a costumed Superboy before he becomes Superman. So at the time, in not even just 2009, 2010, but coming off of the end of Infinite Crisis in 2006 and going through those Legion stories, I, again, was really not sold on this idea of Clark as Superboy. So that's one reason why I was always a little bit resistant to this. The other reason is my deep and continuing affection and loyalty toward Superman Birthright, which, for my money, remains the best telling of the Superman origin story. And it bothered me, and honestly, it still bothers me, how quickly Birthright was supplanted as the official origin story for Superman. One of the beautiful things I think about the passage of time and the way we're kind of looking at everything now on this show is that I will always have that story on my shelf, and I can always grab it, and I can always read it, and I can always enjoy it. And we're getting this spiritual follow-up in the form of the last days of Lex Luthor as we speak. So the story exists unto itself, and that can never be taken away. However, there was and there remains this frustration that we had. Man of Steel by Byrne was 86, and then you don't get Birthright until 2003. It was published 2003 to 2004. So not quite 20 years, but almost. That's a substantial amount of time before you get another major telling. And again, when I say major telling, I know issues here and there or Secret Files and Origins issue, like they'll have a telling of the origin, but I'm talking about like full-on sustained soup to nuts tellings of the origin story. I even put stuff like For All Seasons and American Alien in their own category. I've referred to them as the emotional tellings of the origin because they're not the soup to nuts full-on origin story. They mine the emotional journey of the character and they visit with the character at key moments in more of a vignette style. But in my mind, I look at the major tellings as Man of Steel, Birthright, and Secret Origin. And so again, you have almost 20 years between Man of Steel and Birthright, and then a far shorter amount of time, 5 years between the end of Birthright and the start of Secret Origin. And again, and this is why I brought this up before, in my mind, it's an even shorter amount of time because the effect of the Johns version of the origin was already in play well before Secret Origin started to be published. So those are the two reasons why I've always been a little bit resistant. I'm happy to say, though, that now for this episode, I think I was able to take the most objective look at Secret Origin that I've ever been able to. Because again, so much time has passed and I'm on this Superboy journey, and I was able to really kind of look at it for what it is. And I've also kind of put the call out on social media, and obviously I've spoken to people over the years, and this has come up, and I get the sense this is one where I don't want to say people are so sharply divided, but it's not that everyone's all in one camp or the other. There's definitely a split on this. What's interesting to me, though, is that everyone kind of zeroes in on the same thing about this story. Okay. It's just that their assessment of whether or not it's a good thing differs. But everyone, and from what I've seen at least, zeroes in on the fact that Superman's Secret Origin synthesizes, draws from so many different stories from Superman media. I mean, you look at that first issue alone, and it's like multiple seasons of Smallville all swirling together. You got Blue Shirt, Red Jacket. You got Clark saving Lana from a tornado. You got young Lex, even though they're not actually friends in this. They just have a couple of meetings. You have sexual arousal triggering his heat vision. Again, the moment of the discovery with the spaceship. It's like multiple seasons of that show all kind of swirling together there. You have in the art style and the characterization of Superman and Clark, very much in keeping with the Richard Donner Superman films. So much so when Superman makes his debut and he catches Lois as she's falling off the building and he catches the helicopter, they don't give us the line, who's got you, but they almost do. It's like, it's so close. You can feel it. The fact that we have Metallo as our first villain, I guess that kind of harkens back a bit to Byrne, Superman #1, but also to Superman the Animated Series, right? That Metallo armor right out of that. Of course, Clark being Superboy, Lex living in Smallville. We have shades of the pre-crisis comics. Lex having an abusive father. We're kind of in post-crisis territory. Like, there's a lot that's just kind of swirling around. And I think there are a lot of people who look at this as as a positive, as like, oh, no matter what your preferred version of the story is, whatever your touchstone is for Superman, chances are it's represented in this story. On the other hand, I think there's an argument that this doesn't have much new to say. And I will talk more about that, but let me toss it back to you, especially this idea of the synthesis, whether or not that's a positive or not in the story. I mean, how do you feel?
Just have to roll it back a little bit. I'm glad that you now have the, like at the time, I think that you did not want Superboy because you did not see that as an additive concept. You were like, why is this come back? Why is this a thing? This is not necessary. Why? But I think that now, through your, exhaustive interaction with the Superboy character, I think that, and I think it's good and refreshing that you're interacting with this upon presumably your second read in a different way.
You think I've only read this 2 times?
Well, I don't know. I don't know if you read it initially and you're like, this is not what I want, and you never looked at it again.
Wait, this is probably I don't know, this is probably like 5th or 6th reading.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, I thought you would have put this down, never to interact with this particular thing again. And I would have picked up on none of those Smallville allusions you just mentioned. I picked up on absolutely none of those. I just thought they were logical story beats, not that they were from, a different media source. Obviously, the Richard Donner, Christopher Reeve stamp is heavy on this thing. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's very heavy. Although Gary Frank's art is beautiful, but the young Clark Kent's face sometimes, he doesn't quite have that. He didn't quite have that under control. He got a little out of control, in my opinion, where it didn't on other characters in the story, even other kids in the story didn't. Man, this is I'm torn on this story. I really am. A little all over the place on this one.
Well, here, let me offer this. And to answer Rick's question of kind of like where I land on this. So actually, you know what? Let me also say this in fairness, because I don't, we're already a half hour in, but I don't want people to be like, oh, you're just going to lay waste to this story. I know that there is a lot of love for it from a lot of people. And let me be clear, for the record, it is an enjoyable, entertaining read. And
absolutely agreed.
Right. It's a good read. And it's something where if someone were to come up to me and say, oh, hey, like I just picked this up, I'm going to read it, I would say, awesome. I hope you enjoy. Let me know what you think. Like I wouldn't tear it from their hands and be like, no, you got to read Birthright instead. At the same time, if someone came up to me and said, hey, I'm looking to read Superman's origin, what do you recommend? This is not what I would put in their hands. I would give them Birthright. Unless, going back to conversations about, the making those recommendations, unless there was something they indicated to me that suggested to me that that Secret Origin or something else would be a better fit. But absent all of that, if we're really just kind of in a vacuum, no, this is not the origin story that I would give. I have kind of two major issues with this, I suppose. Maybe they're the same, maybe they're related, but we've already been circling around this. Structurally, this is not, it's a 6-issue miniseries. It's not a 6-issue story. This is not a 6-part story. This is a 2-part story about Clark in Smallville, and it's a 4-part story about adult Clark in Metropolis. And never the two shall meet. I mean, it's so, you said before, like this abrupt time jump. It's kind of odd to me. And I've read almost all of the comic book bibliography of Geoff Johns. Like I've read all his stuff just about. And it feels like kind of an odd choice. It also feels like an instance where editorial might have said, hey, there might be a different way to structure this. Because I look at it and you could argue maybe this is overdone at this point and it would be cliche, but had we started with Clark arriving in Metropolis and over the course of the 6 issues, you got these flashbacks to his time in Smallville and perhaps something in his past that tied into the challenge he's facing in the present. I mean, as we get deeper into the story in the present day or with adult Clark, you have all this business about Lex, again, correctly theorizing that Superman is an alien. And, sharing this information through Sam Lane, to Lois, and just kind of all with this idea of trying to turn the people against Superman. In the past, when Clark was visiting with the Legion of Superheroes, they contended with human supremacists and all of this anti-alien sentiment. So you would think that maybe there's some kind of parallel that could be drawn there. And the juxtaposition of those events in Clark's past and in his present could work together effectively. You don't get that, though. I mean, as the reader, I guess you put it together in your head, I suppose. But it makes for kind of like, again, an abrupt shift. And it just feels like such a disconnect. These really don't feel like, these issues don't feel like one cohesive 6-issue storyline to me.
No, absolutely not. And I wonder if was there too much pressure on this thing? This thing is called Superman Secret Origin. Okay. Versus just, here's a cool Superman story and Superboy's back as a thing. Was there too much pressure on this? Because you're absolutely right. This is, to say it's disjointed is an understatement. And I'll throw this one over to you. I think there was an opportunity here for a trilogy of stories, which DC has done before. You'll recall an Elseworld story, Superman, Batman Generations. There were 3 series of that interconnected. And I think there was an opportunity to really invest in this and make it into an evergreen, graphic novel or omnibus or whatever you want to call it. Because what you have in the first 2 issues, that's new. We're sorting out some things. How did this work? How did Powers develop? How did he how did Clark decide to want to help people discreetly, but also he really wanted to wear this thing while doing it? But you get 2 issues of that. That's it. As far as I recall, there's not even a flashback to anything there.
No.
Issue 3, you have jumped forward, is it safe to say 10 years? And yeah. I don't know. I don't know how old he is, but you can guess that, he's an adult by that point and he has finally arrived in the city. Which that's a separate story that I would have shown up for. I think people would have shown up for it, but I think it's a missed opportunity. Maybe editorial wouldn't allow for it. Maybe Johns wasn't trying to do all that. I don't know, but it really seemed like there's an opportunity for a larger presentation for the secret origin of Superman.
Yeah. Well, and in fairness, look, I can't answer what we only have the finished product. I don't know exactly what internally at DC, from DC itself and or Johns individually, what the intention was and what the objective was. If the idea was, hey, we want a trade paperback out there that again synthesizes decades worth of Superman media that could kind of speak to anyone regardless of what their frame of reference is for the character, something that serves as more of a template to kind of give you an introduction to the basics of the character. I think it succeeds in that respect. I don't think it succeeds as a thematically and narratively cohesive story in the way that, not to be a broken record, something like Birthright does. I just don't think it succeeds in the same way. But again, I don't know exactly what the objective was. And all this business about the synthesis, I think for people who this really resonated with, I think there are a couple of things at play. Number one, and we've come at this numerous times over the years, and I think a lot of fans can identify with this. I do think there is a generational aspect to this. I think that whatever origin story, and this doesn't go just for Superman, I like to take your pick of any character, but since we're talking Superman, I think whichever version of the origin story hit you at the right moment, at a formative time in your life and or fandom, I think that's probably the one that's the default, right? And we have a whole generation. It was Byrne's Man of Steel for folks like myself, I think in my age group, not speaking for everyone, but I think Birthright looms rather large. And then others for whom it's Secret Origin. So I think, kind of when this hits you in your life and in your fandom, I think that's a huge piece of it. So I think there could be people who love Secret Origin because like that was their first Superman origin story. I think there's also, I'm sure, a contingent of people who strongly disliked Byrne's reboot and the jettisoning of Clark's past as Superboy, who really welcomed the return of that concept in Secret Origin. So I think that's another contingent who probably very kind of keen on this. And then again, those for whom that synthesis aspect really resonates with them. They like the idea that you kind of have all of these different takes, swirling together. I think for me, I fall more in the camp of it has the effect of not having as much new to say. But at the same time, I guess I do see the value in having a book like that where you could hand it to someone and be like, oh, well, if you love if someone said I love Smallville, I would give them 4 all season. See, this is the problem with this. But I do think there can be some value in having that kind of story out there. But again, so I know there are folks who really love this, and I think those are probably some of the reasons why, understandably.
So I did not connect to Birthright at all. I've largely rejected Birthright, and that could be where I was with my DC Comics versus where you were at the time. But I really didn't connect with or carry that one around with me. But at the same time, am I going by the letter of Secret Origin? I guess I'm just sort of flying without a parachute when it comes to Superman's origin. Like, well, what is his origin? I'm not really worried about that right now. So.
Well, here on this podcast, Jermaine, these are the things we think about and we wrestle with and not worry about, but we do, we do give a lot of thought and consideration to. And I mentioned this last week, but just as a refresher for folks and to share with you, I was able to get a response from DC. As of now, they do consider Secret Origin to be the origin generally for Superman, because that was a little bit of an open question after the various reboots and whatnot, but I was able to get that confirmation. So, at least as of now, this is still kind of what DC considers to be the origin of the character. Before we wrap, I do want to get into kind of what happened after this, because I think there's some interesting aspects to this, and of course we'll tie in Doomsday Clock, because I never pass up an opportunity to talk about that. But yeah, Secret Origin.
But what you just said makes everything so much worse, because if this material is our modern day origin of the Superman character is on the shelf week after week, and this thing is not available in softcover, that makes it even worse. That makes all of this even worse.
No arguments. On a happy postscript, though, to last week's episode, we bemoaned the lack of availability of Final Crisis Legion of Three Worlds. Since that recording, we saw the DC 2025 catalog, and there will be a deluxe edition of Final Crisis Legion of Three Worlds. I feel like we manifest a lot on this podcast. Unfortunately, due to the timing, I think that was already in the works, but the timing is still great, and I'm glad that now people will have an opportunity to pick that up and add it to their shelves. And even though I do already own the previous hardcover, I'll buy that in the deluxe version. I want to support it. Aw Yeah Comics celebrates and promotes everything that is wonderful about comics, toys, artwork, and the joy they bring to people. Visit them in person at one of their 3 locations: Harrison, New York, aka my local comic shop, Skokie, Illinois, or Muncie, Indiana. If you have kids and have been looking for a family-friendly store, look no further. Join Aw Yeah for exciting events, including creator signings, how-tos, and more. Visit awyeahcomics.com and follow Aw Yeah on social media for more. Their name says exactly how they feel about it. Say it with me now. Aw yeah. Fat Moose Comics is New Jersey's best and oldest comic book store. Established in 1982 and under new ownership since 2020, Moose sells a wide selection of comics from every publisher and time period, along with action figures, graphic novels, posters, statues, and more. If you're looking for something and they don't have it, they can probably get it for you. They know a guy. Visit Fat Moose in Whippany the next time you're in the Garden State, and be sure to reach out via the Fat Moose Comics Facebook page. We reference the television series Smallville a lot around here, and there's one Smallville rewatch podcast that's always at the top of my queue. Always Hold On to Smallville, hosted by our pal, Zach Moore. Zach and his guests bring tremendous insight, passion, and humor as they discuss each and every episode of the series that ushered in the renaissance of superhero TV. Listen to Always Hold On to Smallville wherever you get podcasts, and keep an eye out for the other shows under the Always Hold On to banner, including Arrow, DC's Legends of Tomorrow, Superman and Lois, and Star Wars. So, circling back to this idea of the disjointedness of it and how it really feels like two stories in one. Like I said, I would have vastly preferred this focused on the Superboy time. I'm not just saying that because this is what we're covering at the moment, but I do think that's, like I said, where John's had something new and different to say, because when we get to issues 3, 4, 5, and 6, everything about him putting on the Superman costume for the first time and showing himself to the world, Lois not being afraid, Lex correctly guessing that he's an alien, trying to turn the tide of public opinion against him, a public battle in the streets where Superman is ultimately able to win over the people with his spirit and show them the way. Again, I really don't mean to turn this into a Birthright thing, but like that's what Birthright did. And I think Birthright did it in a more, certainly a more developed, in-depth way. And I don't know on that front that this really, I almost sound like such an arrogant jerk here, but like when it comes to the Superman origin story, I do feel like there is something, bear with me here, but something sacred about it. And I don't feel like these stories should be put out lightly. And I think if you're going to retell the origin, it needs to justify its existence. And in issues 3, 4, 5, and 6, 2/3 of this 6-issue storyline, I don't think there's enough there to really justify its existence, which might sound like a crazy thing to say, but just because I feel like it was covering the same ground in a way that I, again, arguably from my perspective, had been covered better not that long ago. In fairness, where I think Johns actually did have an interesting angle in the Metropolis aspect of the story was his take on the city, right? The fact that nobody looks.
It's in my notes for sure.
Nobody looks up in the sky except the people who gather outside Lex's building, right? Because he chooses one of them each day to give them a better life. It's this human lottery that they participate in. But when Clark gets there, he bumps into this old lady. She chastises him. She thinks he's going to steal her purse. And again, it's just very, very abrupt with him. And then, of course, you have that circular ending where you have this another young man at the end of the story who bumps into her, and he's like, "Oh, I'm sorry, I was looking up." And she's like, "Oh, you'll fit right in. We always look up. We don't always see Superman, but we know he's there." So just kind of this idea that there's a hopelessness in the city that, of course, Luthor is manipulating and capitalizing on, and that the tide slowly starts to change over the course of the story. And the Daily Planet itself. At the beginning of the story, there's graffiti outside. There's rust on the globe. It doesn't turn. Perry, they've had to lay off so many staff members. The only people Perry can hire are what do they call them? Like the troublemakers or the fresh fish, which I actually thought was a great touch because we always talk about like, how does Clark land this job at the Daily Planet? And the idea that, they're actually kind of in dire straits. And that's, Perry does see something in him, but also like they're not being as selective as maybe they could be because of the state that they're in. So again, I think there was something there to that angle that Johns tapped into that was distinct and that was compelling. But the rest of it, like I said, just felt like ground we had already covered not that long before.
What do you really have here? You've got 2 issues of the Superboy of Smallville, right? And you're going to jump forward and you are going to see Clark leaping into action to help someone like he would have done at home. But in the Metropolis, oh no, I think I made a terrible mistake just now by helping this person and everybody saw me do it. You've got Metropolis is not a safe place. It's not like Gotham where you might be an unsolved mystery, but it's not cool. It's not a good place at all. The Daily Planet is not a good place to work. It's a very unsafe work environment. Clearly, Perry White has been put in check, shall we say. Like he's still doing the job, and Lois is very capable, and he's kind of guiding her towards, look, if you want to go the distance on a story, you've got to do it a certain way. He's still got that in him, even though maybe he's not covering all he could, but he's like, look, if you think something's there, you've got to do it this way, not your usual thing. You got to do it a certain way if we're going to do this at all. You've got the conclusion where the city rejects Lex Luthor and his, handing out crumbs to the people, and they embrace this guy helping out where he can. They're not expecting him to solve all their problems, but they're like, look, there he goes. He's going somewhere. He's helping somebody out. I'm in trouble right now. Hey, he just showed up to help me. Maybe I can help out this other person too. So I think those are the takeaways from this? Those elements there?
I think so.
I think those are the things we're supposed to get out of this.
And look, in fairness, it's interesting talking about any of this, but especially when we're talking, I feel like the origin in particular, people have strong feelings and people have their favorites. And, if anyone's listening to this, they're like, oh, Anthony's just too hung up on birthright. Maybe I am. Like,
maybe
that might be, which is fine. Again, we all have our favorites. Again, in fairness and looking at some positives here, I think there are some good arcs. Like you and I both just laid out, I think the city itself, the spirit of the city, has a nice arc in this. Lois, right? We meet her having this argument with Perry White, and she's talking about how she's the best reporter he's got, and she wants to cover the failing infrastructure and this beauty pageant that the mayor's wife is sponsoring. And Perry is under all of this pressure from the publisher, right, and the city, right? Like they're in dire straits, and they really can't afford to push those buttons. Which is
Luthor, you feel the Luthor is looming over that.
Absolutely. which is a departure from the Perry White of the past. And there's this moment where Lois quotes one of Perry's old articles, and he's like, I hate when you quote me to me. But he does make this important point to her that, a great reporter isn't cynical, right? A great reporter is objective, and everything Lois has been writing has had this cynical bent to it. And so the fact that then she could see Superman as this, I mean, again, I guess she's not looking at him objectively either, but I think maybe her optimism for Superman and her cynicism for everything else, like it kind of balances her out a little bit. So I like the arc that she has over the course of this. And go ahead.
A couple of takeaways I think you're supposed to get out of this, that Clark is creating this persona to where he is, making mistakes. He's knocking stuff over, but he's creating this mask where that guy could not possibly be Superboy. Or Superman. Sorry, sorry, but he's creating this mask where he's capable. He's doing his job. He's operating as Superman, but he's creating this mask. And occasionally, like during the restaurant scene, he lets that slip, where he is delivering some really thoughtful and meaningful ideas to Lois. And he let that veneer fall, and she's like, wait a minute, there's something more to you. Then he has to quickly spill everything around him to cover. You're also, I believe, supposed to get out of this that Clark Kent has never interacted with a woman like Lois Lane before. He's completely taken with how she works, how she does things, how she gets things done. Gary Frank does draw her in certain ways from time to time. There's not how we're accustomed to Lois being drawn, but whatever. And Superman, Clark probably notices that. And again, you see that moment where she has this, who is this Clark Kent guy? There's something going on here. That's an interesting guy. And not just the Superman, incredible. What's going on there? It really is the two. I will say, I think that Luthor is completely one-dimensional in this whole thing, but he does carry over. I think he's being genuine when he is, after I can't remember if it's after the Parasite incident, which is nobody's favorite character, or after Metallo's beaten to where, in front of the public, he's like, look, this guy is an alien of some sort. We don't know what his deal is. We don't know what's going on with this. I think he's being genuine. He's not just like, oh, this guy's stealing my spotlight. I think he means that. He's like, we don't know what this is. I don't know what this is. I don't know what his intentions are, but they cannot be good. I think he means that.
Yeah, I know. I don't disagree with that. And circling back to Lois, and Clark and this persona that he's created. Look, that's another one of the reasons why I had some initial reluctance to Secret Origin and this was not limited to Secret Origin. You also saw this in what Johns was doing in Action Comics at the time as well and he had Richard Donner co-writing with him in Action Comics, was really this infusion of the Christopher Reeve, Richard Donner version of the character and the more bumbling Clark. I mean, which was such a deviation from the post-crisis, ultra-capable, confident, assertive Clark that I had grown up reading. And so all of a sudden now in the comics, you have Perry White making these cracks about like, how did he land Lois Lane, right? Stuff like that. And it never sat right with me because of the departure that it was. Again, that now has kind of faded away with time. Now I can just kind of look at this more in and of itself, and I'm not as bugged by that. To Johns' credit, he does create moments like what you pointed out in the diner. And the other big one that jumps out is when Clark stares down Sergeant John Corbin, who has this romantic interest in Lois and is not taking her cues that she's not interested. And Clark stands his ground and they shake hands. And Clark, of course, has that steel grip.
That was he was not being careful with use of his powers in that scene. I think just as a person, he was like, no, you're not going to, out handshake me. But that was kind of like, that was almost a tip off that something was going on there.
But in defense of Lois, right? Like I like that he would, that was, I think, a slip a bit, but the fact that he would do that for her, and even if it shows some fallibility on Clark's part, I like that. And I think Johns had to do that because this still had to line up with the existing continuity of the day where Lois and Clark were married. So if Clark in this story is only ever just knocking stuff over and being this big doof, then it's like, well, how do they ultimately end up together? But I think in this story, you get these moments where he shows her something, and you could see why Lois would have some sort of interest in Clark. The fact that Lois too, there are things I liked. I liked that Lois noticed that Clark was putting on an act. Like she clocks that, right? She knows that
why?
He wants
why is
to
he
be
doing that?
Why he wants to be underestimated. And I think ultimately by the time we get to the end of the story, her conclusion is that he's her competition, right? Like he wants to be underestimated so he can scoop her or whatnot. Which, at least I like that. It's like, because she sees through this facade. She doesn't ultimately come to the ultimate truth, but at least she kind of recognizes that. And there are those moments between them. So I thought, that worked. I thought the friendship with Jim was great. Right?
Absolutely. They really bonded over like, look, things are not working out for me here in the city. I think I might have to go home because this is not going well. And they both felt that way for different reasons. And they were both like, we're going to keep at this. We're going to keep at it.
Yeah, because, Superman has had this public debut. And, when he first shows up after saving Lois and people swarm around him, that had shades of Byrne's Man of Steel, right? That moment that Clark then later would talk to Jonathan about is like, I felt like they all wanted a piece of me, right? Like when they're kind of all around him. And then again, you continue to have, Lex, posing these questions. And you get to this point where Superman is a bit resigned, there on the roof of the planet and finds Jim, thinks Jim is going to jump. And he's like, no, but Jim is thinking of going back home to Yonkers. Shout out to my home, home county of Westchester. Yeah. Of going home to Yonkers. And Superman's like, well, I don't have many friends here. I would hate to lose you. And
is that correct, or is that like a adjustment that he's from there? I don't know.
I honestly don't know offhand. I'd have to do a little digging on that front. But I love the fact that he's in this version, at least, that Jim is from Yonkers. And then Jim asks if he could take Superman's photo, and then though he's initially reluctant, he goes along with it. And then you have this whole runner where I think the next issue opens with a fire. And then after Superman saves everyone, he and Jim have this moment. All right, what can we do this time? Right. And then he's holding up the truck. And the fact that this helps the Daily Planet more than get back up on its feet, because Jim is the only one Superman will pose for, and Lois is the only one he'll give quotes to.
Yeah. Yeah. And they're kind of operating sort of as this team.
Yeah.
That was very interesting to watch as well. You're more plugged into Superman than I am at this stage. Where does the helicopter catch come from? It's in a lot of stuff, but where does it come from? That rooftop, the helicopter's falling, Lois is falling.
The most iconic certainly is Superman the movie. I don't know offhand if there was a precursor to that.
Okay, because it's also in Superman the animated series. It's definitely there, and I guess because of that. So I was just wondering it probably is that film.
Yeah. And then the other thing with Jimmy, too, that I really loved was the juxtaposition of Jimmy's parents with Clark's, right? Because Jim talks about how, like, I got to go home with my tail between my legs. Like, my parents told me this was a bad idea. I wouldn't make it. And I don't know if Jim outright asks, like, what did your parents say to you or something like that? But you see this flashback to Clark on the front porch with Jonathan and Martha. He's like, I'll make you proud. And Pa's like, you already have. You already do. So, again, like moments like that, I thought were great.
So let's not underserve our villains in this story. And I found it so Parasite is an early Silver Age Superman villain. Obviously Luthor definitely is an early, Golden Age. Though he's been through different depictions, various degrees of mad scientist, which you have that in this character. You have mad scientist, an unscrupulous mad scientist is in play here, not just the businessman of Man of Steel, 1980s. Metallo, I'm trying to remember. I remember him being like very active in the 70s, but he might go back to Silver Age. Maybe not like a enduring villain, but I think he might go back to Silver Age.
If I'm not mistaken, he makes his debut in the same issue that Supergirl first appears in, because there were two stories, and I think he's the other story in that.
But then, Brainiac is an early villain. There are not a ton of enduring. There's a lot of one-off villains in the Silver Age, a ton of them. There's not a lot of enduring ones, but it's like, why do we, again, room for a trilogy or at least a sequel? Because you get Parasite and you don't really know what becomes of that character. He's defeated pretty quickly. You get Metallo, which is, and I found myself kind of hung up on this one. I was like, that's not the origin of Metallo. Do I care? Because it seemed like he was a John Jameson character. If you remember him from Amazing Spider-Man comics, like a, iconic military man, very handsome, like someone that just everybody looks up to. Only this guy was not a good guy, but he really seemed like he was an evil John Jameson. So it's like, how much do I care that they've made quick changes to Metallo's origin? They made quick changes to Parasite's origin. How much do I even care? Probably not that much, right? But it's also like, why those two? Or why not elevate someone else? Or the temptation to create a new character to place in that time period, that's how these stories usually go. You insert a new character into the mix, a la Conduit. But I just don't know why those two and no one else. I don't know. And I also found myself not being hung up on this isn't the origin for them that I know, because it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. I really thought that making Rudy Jones already in a manner, a type of parasite before the accident happens to him, that was very interesting storytelling, to where he really is kind of preying on Clark Kent's good nature consistently. And Clark initially doesn't know what's happening. And then maybe he doesn't care it's happening because maybe the guy's got, maybe the guy's life is not so good. Maybe he needs a break and he can provide that. But I don't know. Should there have been more villains or a new villain, or what do you think about that? What we got?
I didn't mind that. I that's actually an aspect of it that I liked, because Lex remains our primary antagonist, but we get a couple of other adversaries in the mix. And no, they're not Brainiac or Zod, right? They're the next tier of villain, but you get them some play, and I think they serve a valuable function. So that actually was an aspect of it that I didn't mind, and I thought that worked well. So I didn't have any objection to that. And
are you more interested in Parasite and Metallo through this? Are they more important to you than they had been previously?
Not really. I mean, Metallo, the whole notion of Metallo working for Lois's father, having this romantic interest, this dark side of him. Yeah, I mean, I think it worked. What really sang for me was when we get to the climax after Superman has taken down Metallo, and the people have converged around him, because Sam Lane has given the order to take Superman in, and one of the other soldiers is like, hey, because over the course of this battle, I mean, Corbin now as Metallo has really lost it, right? And he's endangering his own men and civilians. And so now even among the other soldiers, there's this reluctance to try to take Superman in. And then you get the people on the street, like literally coming to Superman's defense. And after all that, one of them says something to the effect of like, what do you want from us? Or what do you want us to do? And I really did love Superman's response here of like, I want you to stop looking for a savior. It's not Lex Luthor and it's not me. You have to look within yourself. Like, I have these gifts and this is how I choose to use them. You all have gifts within yourselves, and we need to all work together to make this a better place.
And that's the Kents coming out at that moment. That's the Kent's coming out.
He does what he can because that's what he was raised to do, and he does what he's able to. He's just able to do a lot more. But everyone is capable of something, and so, I definitely liked that message.
And this is also the military is equally like, look, Corbin was firing on all of us, and this guy stopped all of that from happening. So what are we doing here? Even they gave pause to their orders. Is General Lane a villain in this, or is he kind of on the wrong side of things, and you hope he can turn around, or is he a bad guy too?
He's a bad guy, and I mean, I can't divorce this from the new Krypton saga, where we did a couple episodes on that last year. It's a fun read. It's a great binge for anyone who like wants to sink their teeth into 100-issue long saga. But the Sam Lane there, I felt was very one note, and I like a Sam Lane who has some more dimension to him. Another moment, though, that I really like, speaking of Sam Lane, is when he reveals to Lois that Superman is an alien, right? He's like, did he tell you that he's an alien? Does that. And he refers to Superman as a monster, and this great juxtaposition, because right as he's saying that to Lois, we cut to Lex performing the surgery on Corbin to turn him into Metallo. And Lex looks up like maniacal as ever, like Dr. Frankenstein. He's like, he's alive. So obviously, Lex and or Corbin, right? They're the monster, not Superman. But I like that juxtaposition there.
So there's also that moment, because of your first two issues, where Clark has interacted with Lex Luthor. I mean, the interaction meant more to him than it did to Luthor. Again, Luthor could have been talking to himself, because Luthor really looks. Anyone that's not him is just not worth the time of day, cannot understand anything that's going on. And that's how he interacts with Clark. But were you waiting for more of a aha moment between, obviously Clark/Superman is like, I know exactly who you are. But that interaction meant nothing to Luthor. So, of course, he would not consider nor recall beyond that moment years ago or that 1 second there give any merit or bearing to that entire interaction. I thought it might be more of a confrontation versus like nothing.
Yeah, dude, 1,000%. I don't understand why you would give Lex a past in Smallville if you're not going to make it more meaningful for both characters. It's weird to me that, and look, this might be another instance where I've got Smallville on the brain, but it's weird to me here. It's not even that they're friends in Smallville. I mean, like they have a couple of fleeting meetings, and the second one in the library ends with Clark saying we should hang out sometime. And Lex just takes his beat and Huff is like, why would we do that? And that's it. And so I don't know what that really adds to the proceedings. Now, kind of on that note, I want to circle back to these first two Smallville set issues here. And again, this is where we see him become Superboy, right? Like we knew this was a part of his past in the post-Infinite Crisis landscape, but now we actually see how it gets to play out. As someone yourself, you talked about how, you had gone back, you had read stories of Clark as Superboy and a Legion fan. That aspect coming back into play, I know you were not put off the way I was. So in terms of how he becomes Superboy and just kind of how that all fits into this, just curious your thoughts on that, how well that worked for you.
I mean, then and also now I'm like, we're getting something, but it's not coalescing into like the thing. You know what I mean? Like we're getting bits and pieces of things here and there. Real quick before we get back into that, just to go back to the Luthor aspect of things, I think that, again, Luthor is completely one note for the flattest character in this entire story. But by the end of your story, I think that Luthor is completely incapable of understanding Superman, like what his goals really are. Like, cannot understand Superman and will not understand Superman. I think that Clark doesn't really understand how someone can be this way, but he's also like, I can't let you make life worse for everybody. I can't do that. So he doesn't fully understand why is he like this, but he's sure I can't let you do that. So if you're going to keep doing that, I'm going to keep stopping that.
But yeah, I don't mean to cut you off, but no, on that note, I agree. I think maybe I got slightly more mileage out of this Lex than you did, but I also don't disagree with you. I think this needed to be more fully developed, I think, for this Lex to really work. I mean, we know that he has this abusive father in his past, which we can circle back to now as we go back to those first couple of issues. So of course there's that. And clearly, even from those early days in Smallville, this desire to get out, to make something of himself, and this pursuit of money and power, right? And you see that he's achieved that, and the way he lords it over the people of the city, and that final exchange with Superman where he's like, "This is my city, my people." And of course, Superman's retort of, they don't belong to you, they don't belong to me. But yeah, we don't have, again, that personal animosity between them because they only had those fleeting encounters. And we really don't, there's the anti-alien sentiment, but this isn't Lex the ideologue that we've seen in other stories as well, where it's like Superman's presence limits human achievement and this and that, and he has this power and we can't trust him. I don't know. There are a couple of different motivations, I guess, kind of at play for him. But yeah, coalesce, I think, is a good word. I think here, too, I don't know that it really coalesces into a specific enough worldview from the character that we can really say, like, that this is what this Lex Luthor is about.
The weird kid from the first 2 issues got older and has unlimited resources. He's still that same kid, even the way he interacts with his other staff, from security to, fellow scientists, taking action on his ideas. He treats them all the same. That they're not him and they don't understand what's happening, but he's still surrounded by idiots, just the way he was in Smallville, is how he looks at it. But to go back to Smallville itself, I appreciated the tornado scene, definitely, because this is a hang up for me with Man of Steel. The hang up with me, not to come back to that, but I appreciated that Clark, he leapt into action when people were in danger. And, consequences, he's not worried about that. Somebody needs help immediately, and I think I can do something for this. And he does take action. He's not wearing a mask or anything. If people saw it or they didn't, he's not worried about that. But he also talks to the Kents about, I think I kind of flew a little bit. They're like, what? You flew? Knowing that he's going to be able to do things. I thought that was a good Kent moment. That Man of Steel movie, when it had that moment of, you can't save everybody, people might see you. That movie lost me forever on that one. Let's not gloss over the Krypton element of it, because you of course have like your I guess it's leaning into like the movie version of Jor-El and Laura, but also when Martha has that interaction, is she not seeing like classic Silver Age Kryptonian imagery? Is some of that not in there? That was very interesting to me, that she caught a little bit of that she knew some of that world as well. Well, and the visual of it was the old stuff.
Yeah, so a couple of things. So yeah, the crystal motif, right? Definitely out of the Donner movies. Martha kind of surveying the aesthetic of Krypton. Again, shades of Birthright in there, if memory serves. But as far as what she sees, this was actually, and I assume it comes from Johns, but either way, this was an idea that really played out in the New Krypton saga, that I really, really loved this. The idea that there are these different guilds on Krypton, and they all have different garb. So we have our scientists, we have our military leaders, we have our religious personnel. And it was a way to, once again, the word synthesize, but like bring in all these different versions of Krypton that we've seen over the years. Like they all sort of had a place here. It was just that they were representations of the different guilds. So that aspect I thought was really great.
The cool thing and the additive thing about the interaction with the Legion of Superheroes, which are characters from the distant future of the DC universe, when through the United Planets, where there are various worlds where the inhabitants naturally have certain abilities, that representatives from each world work together as this group of superheroes. They're not licensed, they're not monitored by anything, but they're just there to help, and they're from everywhere. I thought it was cool that at that early stage of his career, and these people are not scientists, they're breaking all kinds of continuity rules. They're not supposed to go back in time. They're not supposed to interact with a pivotal figure. They're not supposed to do any of that stuff, but yet they're doing it because they're not scientists. They just thought it would be cool to do. And they bring him to the future where he's able to see people not wearing a mask, dressing in weird and unique to the individual costume, for lack of a better word, or uniform or something, they were doing on a big scale what he'd kind of been trying to do just a little bit sometimes. So you got to see that. And again, they were not wearing masks. They were as operating as themselves. I think that was pretty important, whether you know Legion history or not, that was a big part of the story. He got to see that A, there is a future, and that there were people his age doing stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Clark in the present Clark in Smallville has to hide, twice over, because as Clark Kent, he can't participate in the other activities that his friends are, like football, after what happens at the beginning of the story when he inadvertently breaks Pete Ross's arm, right? So there's this aspect of hiding amongst his peers on a day-to-day basis. But even when Martha makes him the costume and he starts patrolling and helping people as Superboy, even then he does it in secret. I mean, I suppose at least in part out of embarrassment, he doesn't want to be seen in the costume, but also, again, to not draw attention. So there's this element of hiding a couple of times over. And then, yes, he has this opportunity to be around people who can do something close to what he can do, and they can do it in full view, and he doesn't have to hide at all when he's with them. So yeah, it just kind of, I think, opens up this whole other aspect of himself. So yeah, I mean, that definitely resonates.
So I can suspend my disbelief on a lot of stuff, certainly in a DC Comics Superman story. Was the glasses pushing it too far? That Martha made glasses that could, neutralize heat vision, that she did that? Was that too much?
I could go along with that. And that's in keeping, right, from the pre-crisis era, is it not? I don't know if she does it specifically, but I think the idea is like the glasses come from the rocket.
It sounds right, but I guess I didn't necessarily need that. But, if Peter Parker can develop, web fluid, then she can, carve out some glasses that are not fashionable at all, which kind of, plug into his persona that can, stop heat vision, except for when he wants to use that.
It's funny because the story opens with Clark playing football. And this is the scene where he and Pete Ross collide, and Pete breaks his arm, and Pa comes to pick him up. And Pa's like, "You were supposed to be studying. You told me you were studying." He's like, "I'm sorry." And then from this point forward, Clark will not participate in football or any other sport that his friends invite him to. And he comes up with this, increasingly silly series of excuses, right? Like he has stomach ache from bad eggs, and there's too much pollen, and then this and that.
So he's starting to do the stuff he would do as an adult. He's starting to do that back then.
Yeah. And there's a great moment with Lana where, and this is an interesting angle here, in a departure from the pre-crisis comics and the Smallville TV show, Lana here knows that Clark has abilities. What he ultimately hides from her, at least in the story or the period of time that we see in this story, is that he's an alien. Because there's that scene later where she's like, we still have to figure out how you have these powers. And he knows at this point, but he doesn't share it. But the fact that she knows that he can do these things, I liked that, as opposed to him, completely keeping her in the dark. But she has that line where she's like, "You got to get better at coming up with excuses." But I think it was a very purposeful choice to start with football, because in Byrne's Man of Steel, once we get through the Krypton portion of it, right? Like when we catch up with Clark, he's the football star, right? Like I remember that, that splash page of him doing his football thing. And obviously that was such a departure at the time, the fact that Clark had been this star athlete. So I think this was, right from the jump, you get a taste of it. It's like, oh, he's playing football. But then, like, very quickly we pivot to, no, this is not something that he's going to do. And I will say, and this has come up when we've talked about the origin and just kind of the Clark Kent persona, I don't need adult Clark to be tripping over himself. A little mild-mannered, a little reserved, I think that's fine. If we do get the more confident, assertive post-crisis or George Reeves version, I'm there for that. But mild-mannered, reserved, that works, I think. But for Clark the adolescent, I do think there is that aspect of alienation and, wanting to be normal, wanting to fit in, not being able to do these things that everyone else can do. I think there is something to that. I think there is something valuable about that. So, that departure in Secret Origin, kind of reverting to the, what we had before Byrne, that aspect of it, I was on board with. How did you feel?
It works for me. Literally, I checked, And issue 3 is the chapter title is Mild Mannered Reporter, and that is what you're seeing in this character. That is what you're seeing in him. Obviously, as time and comics move forward, he does stop almost all of that type of that persona as far as aggressively being unassuming, and this guy can't possibly be anything. Why is he even here? That seems to go away in when he's getting award-winning articles and he's covering material, he's doing the work. So that's good. But for these initial purposes, I guess it was kind of okay to see him think that this is how I need to be.
Right.
This is how I need to be.
And,
Yeah,
and we talked about the heat vision that's triggered by his hormones. There's a moment where Lana is comforting him and kisses him, and the heat vision goes off. And again, right out of Smallville, where they really tied the emergence of his powers to puberty and just like his development. So I thought that worked. And then, of course, like you said, we get to the Kents sharing the spaceship with him, right? Because he knows he can do these things, but he doesn't know why. And so they show him the ship, and it activates this hologram of Jor-El and Lara. And a great moment where you see when Jor-El is like, "This is Lara, your mother." You see Martha have a reaction to that, and very natural. So I like that little beat. This is just a personal thing. I don't like in instances like this, or Superman the animated series did the same thing. This is too easy for me for Clark to learn where he comes from. Right. I like the idea if he sees the ship, he knows he's from another planet, but it's like there's a journey he needs to go on to find out more. But like here in the animated series, it's just like, okay, presses a button and he gets all the information he needs. It's efficient. It's quick. It's clean. It's efficient. But I do like when there's a little bit more of a mystery and more of a quest to kind of figure out those aspects. But Clark in his frustration and just confusion, he runs out of the barn. And Jonathan catches up with him and he's like, "Can't I just, I don't want to be different. Can't I just be your son?" And Jonathan comforts him, and it's the splash page of them out in the field. And he's like, "You are my son." David Goyer, who wrote the screenplay for Man of Steel. And, I let it slide about the tornado. We already talked about that. And you're entitled to your opinion. I'll leave it at that. But David Goyer wrote the introduction for the collected edition of this. And he was writing the introduction literally as he was in the middle of his draft of the Man of Steel screenplay. And, we talk about synthesis. This was an instance, this came first, and then Man of Steel borrowed from it, not the other way around. But, you get a play on that scene in the movie where young Clark is like, "Can I keep pretending I'm your son?" And Jonathan's like, "You are my son." And the movie takes it a step further. He's like, "But somewhere out there, you have another father who gave you a different name. He sent you here for a reason. And even if it takes you the rest of your life, you owe it to yourself to find out what that reason is." So, again, I think we took it to the next level with that, but the starting point for that was right here in this.
Yeah, and I think for the purposes of this story, that scene is the end of that. That Clark never wonders about that ever again. Never needs to come up because he got his answer. He never wonders about that one ever again.
Yeah, and then again, like we said, we have this meeting with Lex, and then we have the tornado and saving Lana again. Right out of, one of my favorite moments, that season 1 finale of Smallville when the twister hits. And Lana's pulled up in her car screaming, "Clark!" And he shows up and he just runs into the tornado. To be continued. I was like, oh man, it was great. So, I felt right at home with that. And like you said, that's when he gets this notion that he can fly. And this is then when Martha reveals she's making him a suit, right? Because he comes back after that. He's flying high, literally, right? And figuratively. And he's like, "I want to continue to help people." And she talks about how if you're going to do this, you have to be careful. And I've lost count of how many articles of clothing of yours I found destroyed. So she reveals she's used the blankets and materials he came to Earth in the rocket to fashion this costume. And so that first issue ends with him walking down the stairs in the Superboy costume, embarrassed. How did you feel about that?
So because I was thinking A Christmas Story, in the bunny suit, I did not overthink this thing. I did not say, how is she able to cut the cloth? Why does it look this way? I wasn't thinking about any of those things. I just let it be a funny scene that the Gary Frank artwork sold it to me in a way that not many other artists could have sold it to me. I would have been asking these questions I need not ask versus like, you know, uh, you look ridiculous. Do you want to take it off? Do you want to take that off like from A Christmas Story? So I didn't think too hard about it when I could have. I really could have thought, why is this happening? Why is, because you and I already, everyone knows what the Superman suit looks like. But if you didn't know that, why does that look that way? And that's not the question to pull on.
Well,
it really is.
The idea that she's seen the crest on Jor-El, and the fact that she's had these holographic glimpses into Krypton, and she's seen their kind of attire, and that was what she modeled it. I mean, that I'm on board with. It's the idea of him being embarrassed, and this carries over into the next issue. And I guess for his development, it's important that something different happens when he's with the Legion, right? And I get that. And if he was proudly flying all over the place as Superboy, then there's less to accomplish in the Legion side of it, which I can appreciate. But it felt to me like one of the charges against Clark being Superboy, historically, I feel like, is that there's an aspect of silliness to it. And I feel like that was Johns' way of kind of acknowledging that and having the character recognizing the silliness of it and articulating it in that way. But this feeds into my next, and maybe the biggest picture question of all of this, especially in the context of our Superboy discussion, because this gives us Clark as Superboy, but a Superboy in secret. This is not the pre-crisis Superboy who everyone in town knew, who Chief Parker had a line to, who was on speed dial for the president. And I think at least in part, this was due to the fact that, again, this did still need to fit into the existing continuity of the day. So I think what Johns landed on here was this balance where it's like, okay, you have Superboy, and then that allows Johns to position him with the Legion, which I do genuinely believe was the main reason why Johns would have wanted Superboy back. I think it was to access the Superboy and the Legion side of it. I mean, and this is a question I guess I would ask him. It's like if Johns weren't beholden to any continuity, lining up with the existing continuity of the Superman books, it's like, would he have had Clark be a public Superboy, flying around town, working at the Kent General Store as Clark? Would we have had more of that pre-crisis feel to it? Or would he still have landed on this suburban myth angle? And where we did land with this, I go back and forth on this. I welcome your take, because part of me is like, if you don't like Superboy, it's too much Superboy. If you like Superboy, it's not enough Superboy. So it's like, is it a good balance, or does it not satisfy anybody?
I think that for modern day purposes, the secret Superboy that acts very quickly, or acts at night, or it's like, that's not a real thing. There's no super kid around here. That works because you're getting something. Because what's the whole purpose of this thing? The whole purpose is Clark Kent being active as a hero, a costumed hero, as a young person, not only as an adult for the first time. That's really what you want out of this thing. So again, to have full-on classic Superboy, that would be way too much. And also, pushing believability too far in the modern day world. Like how if you recall in Ultimate Spider-Man, Peter Parker was losing his mask constantly, but fortunately he looks like just some kid. So you still didn't know who he was. But I think that what we got was the best possible way of doing it. We just didn't get enough of it.
Fair. I mean, I think, yes. Well, I guess where I land on this is rationally, logically, yes, this makes the most sense. I think if you were to pose the problem of like, okay, we want to have this aspect of the character restored. We want to be able to tell these Legion stories, but we do still want to preserve, even just in this story itself, we want to preserve Superman making his debut. And we also don't want to blow up the continuity. Because again, Infinite Crisis made some tweaks, but it wasn't a full-on reboot after. So how do we do it? Yes, I do think this is the rational, logical solution to that problem. But from a gut response, and again, I never would have expected myself to say this, right? Given the way I've historically felt about Superboy. But I don't know, like now I just sort of feel like, if you're going to do it, full on do it. Like do the Superboy that we had before. Again, I don't think you really could unless this was just kind of an out of continuity thing, or you full on rewrote the continuity. So again, I understand why we landed here, but part of me just feels like it didn't kind of, if you have that Superboy itch, I don't know that it fully scratches it.
If I'm not mistaken, other than these 2 issues, there's no other miniseries, there's no other one-shots that really go back to this era and unpack it all, or even unpack some of it.
Well,
Mistaken.
There's one other thing.
More.
I think I had texted you about this. There was one other thing, and it was a 6-issue arc of Adventure Comics that was published like right after this, and it was written by Paul Levitz, and it's collected out of print. Oh, big surprise. In a volume called Superboy and the Legion of Superheroes, the early years. And their story set in the early days of the Legion, or of Superboy's tenure with the Legion. And then Paul Levitz would continue to write Adventure Comics, and he also launched a short-lived Legion series right before the New 52. But none of the rest of that featured Clark. It was really just those first 6 issues. And even in those 6 issues, because I read them, Clark really only features in 3 of them. The other ones, he's there, or like it's mostly a flashback story, and he's there for the framing parts of it. But the 3 that he's there for, the first one, I think is the most substantial, where it's him in the future, and he's got a list of all the things he wants to do that he can't do in the present. So it's this contrast. Like back home, Ma and Pa don't even let him leave the city limits. So now in the future, he gets to explore Metropolis. And he doesn't get to play sports at home. So he plays baseball with the Legion, right? Like things like that.
So this is in context of Legion, though. I meant more like, more adventures in Smallville.
Nothing.
With just him.
Yeah. Nothing.
And also, how about this? Do you want there to have been more interactions with Luthor, or what you saw, those 2 instances, that was it until they were both adults? What do you think about that?
No, I would have wanted them to be friends.
Yeah, but the character we saw is incapable of being a friend to anyone. Luthor is incapable from moment 1 of being a friend to anyone. But I do think I think if they were friends, then that character remembers their interactions when they meet again in the city. And I think you can't do that.
Again, that's Birthright accomplished that though. So I think there is we've seen a way of doing that. So, obviously, yeah, they don't go down this road. But like Alex, how do I put this? Alex, who's incapable of being a friend, like ever. I don't know. That's not as interesting to me. It's like it's make an attempt at friendship and then it goes wrong. It's like, oh, okay. Like that's interesting. So yeah, I don't know. I felt like they left something on the table here with Lex and just kind of those fleeting interactions that they had. But just going back to that Adventure Comics run for a minute here, there's another issue where Clark is at the Superman Museum and he sees like statues of Doomsday, right? And this notion that one day he's going to die in battle, kind of weighs on him, but it doesn't really go anywhere. And then the next issue or the one after, it's kind of an inversion of that first one that I was describing, where the Legionnaires come to present day Smallville, or Superboy's Smallville, and essentially engage in like daily activities with Clark, the way he had done with them in the future, right? So like they help stop a tornado and they help with the barn raising and they have dinner with the Ken. So it's who am I to give story notes to the legendary Paul Levitz, right? With all due respect, I wish more had been done with Clark as Superboy generally, especially in Smallville, but even with the Legion, right? Like if we're bringing back this concept, I wish it could have been explored in greater depth. And I don't know. I maybe if you were really a fan of the earlier Levitz run on the Legion, like maybe this is something that really would have spoken to you. I don't know. I'd be curious to hear from people. I don't know that it really kind of popped the way you would have wanted it to, or that this was really mined to the extent that it could have been. I don't know. There's also, what is your feeling on Clark not retaining his memories of the future when he goes back home?
It's a plot device. It's a story trope. Because that allows the Legion to speak freely and that allows him to explore the world. But that's also, man, that's a lot to keep up with as well. Just from a storytelling standpoint. I guess I'm good with that. So we're not breaking the space time continuum, that type of thing. It allows him to have a life and friends and many adventures, and it doesn't destroy everything. He also doesn't have that pressure of like, oh, I can't tell this person this thing I found out, or I know that this is going to happen on this day, and do I intervene or not? He doesn't have that pressure.
Well, one of the reasons I bring it up is that in Secret Origin, when Johns has the Legion come back and bring Clark to the future, and again, he sees them operating freely, contending with these human supremacists. Lightning Lad in particular has fun, right? He has fun using his powers and stopping the bad guys. And this clearly makes an impression on Clark, who, as we see at the beginning of issue 2, like he's operating only in secret. He's got the tunnel, right? In a nod to the pre-crisis comics, he's got the tunnel that leads him back to the Ken house. The save that he performs at the beginning of issue number 2 is Lex's drunken father, whose brakes have been tampered with by Lex. Right. And then Lex gets the call from Chief Parker that his father's alive. And it's obviously a shock to him. But by the end of the issue, the father has died of this mysterious heart condition that clearly Lex had a hand in, and he had taken out a life insurance policy on him. But again, like Clark's operating in secret. There are just like these whispers, these rumors, but no one really puts too much stock in it. And again, Clark himself, there's this sense of embarrassment, this continued alienation where I forget if it's in the first or second issue, but he talks to Lana about how like Pete has stopped asking him to play. Right. And he hears what the other kids say about him, about how weird he is, about how he must be afraid of getting hurt, how he's afraid of girls. Right. And then, of course, you have this moment with the Legion, and you have, again, the arrival of Crypto at the end. So, again, you see that kind of opening up this other side for him. But with the memory aspect, notably in Secret Origin, there's no discussion. There's the discussion about the potential ramifications to the to the timeline, but there's no discussion about his memories being erased in any way. But that does come, and I know this comes from the pre-crisis comics too, but it does come in that Levitt's Adventure Comics run, where in that first issue, when Clark is at the Superman Museum and he's feeling overwhelmed, Saturn Girl talks about placing this post-hypnotic block in his memory so that he doesn't feel overwhelmed or confused when he's there in the future. And that she says explicitly, when he returns to the present, his time in the future will feel like a dream. And maybe I'm taking that too literally, but whoa, do I not like that? I mean, because I feel like, and this has been a recurring question on the podcast, like what value does it serve if Clark is Superboy? And one of the things, and I want to circle back to this question before we wrap up, but like his time as Superboy is one way, right? Depending on what story you're telling, that he learns how to be Superman. Well, if he's having all of these adventures, these experiences, learning these lessons in the future, and then they're like a dream to him when he comes back, it's like, well, is he actually undergoing any true development? Like, I don't like that.
I think that he is, because, maybe you have a dream and it kind of, some aspect of it sticks with you, or you're like, huh, where did I get that? I feel like this has happened before, or just something of that nature. So I don't think it's completely lost. And it's also, it's not just Superboy having a good time in the future. Like he's actually like, helping, and he's part of a team as well. But again, it's comics with an X comics. So I can kind of look the other way on that one if I have to. I don't linger on that one too long. Because there is that duality that he is, operating in the future with the Legion, but he's also, being a young person in the present day. So,
right. I guess my feeling,
if I can accept the one thing, I'm going to have to take the other thing with it too.
I get it. I guess I just feel like it's enough that, I mean, A, you're 1,000 years in the future, so who knows if records are even accurate. The Legion can restrict his access to records that they have. Maybe the Superman Museum doesn't need to be as detailed as it has been. Like, I feel like there are ways where he could avoid such specific knowledge, especially given the amount of time that we're talking about. And then we can avoid this business. It's just kind of a personal thing of mine. One of the things I loved about the Legion of Superheroes animated series, with one exception, where one specific adventure was erased from his memory. It's like they didn't get into that, and I thought it worked very well. So I think there is a path towards that we've seen.
Question for you, because you are more plugged in than I am to the overall Superman of things. Where does Lex's sister come up again?
specifically, like around this period of time, she was a part. Do you remember that Adventure Comics storyline by Geoff Johns and Francis Manapul, The Boy of Steel, that focused on Connor after his return in Legion of Three Worlds? And he was making his list of things that Clark did and things that Lex did, right? Because of course his DNA comes from both, and he, trying to make sure that he's not going to end up like Lex. And one of his classmates, Lori, is the daughter of Lena, who is cancer stricken and bedridden.
Okay.
And Lex shows up. I'm glad you brought this up, because at least twice in Secret Origin, Lex says miracles don't exist. And in that Adventure Comics arc, Superboy essentially challenges Lex to cure Lena. He has this whole thing where he's like, you always say you would do this and that if not for Superman. Well, Superman's off-world on New Krypton now, so you could do anything, save Lena. And so Lex sends Superboy on this quest to retrieve all of these ingredients, and he creates this concoction that cures her mind and her body. And there's someone remarks about a miracle, and Lex says, miracles don't exist. Lex Luthor does, which is a great line. But Lex Luthor giveth and Lex Luthor taketh away. And so after he proves he can do it, he injects her with something else, and she reverts back to her previous condition. And it's so cold, it's so cruel, that Superboy's ultimate takeaway is like, that could never be me. Like, I could never be Lex. So it's an interesting story, but that line about miracles don't exist, Lex Luthor does, it was a nice kind of tie in there.
Okay, cool. I didn't recall any of that handily when I was reading this. I'm going to go back on my kick of hashtag justice for Pete Ross. I feel like this character, man, like, continues to get underserved. And I feel like this is why this should have been 6 issues. Cause it's like this poor kid gets his arm broken and like, that's about it from him. Whereas we know from the pre-crisis comics, like he knew Clark's secret and he kept it to himself for years. And then when he needed Superman's help, when his son was taken to another world, Superman was like, oh, sorry, he's got to stay there. Then he gets killed off panel and whatever happened to the Man of Tomorrow. Then post-crisis, he's just Lana's second choice. He gets used by Ruin as a puppet. He's vice president and then for Lex, and then president for like 2 seconds. I mean, this guy has had a rough road, and I feel like this could have been an opportunity to such is life for Pete Ross.
Oh,
that's this is in line with the character.
I know. But, this is the Superboy that we get in Secret Origin, right? That he's operating in secret and having these adventures with the Legion of Superheroes. Is there anything else? Because I do want to talk about kind of what happens to the idea of Clark as Superboy after this. But anything else about Secret Origin we haven't talked about that you want to?
In around issue 5, I started to change my opinion on this, because around issue 5, you do, even though there's no more Superboy to come, there's no more adventures in Smallville, not part of the story anymore. But around issue 5, you have an interesting, like, oh, okay, how's this going to play out story? How is Superman going to figure out that he can help people, that it can be done? How's he going to figure that out? And that and not have people live in fear of him, which I think he really took that personally. He was like hurt by that because he'd never had that reaction before. So you have a compelling story there. My feelings on it kind of changed around that point.
Creator and podcaster Perry Constantine, host of Superhero Cinephiles, has a special offer for listeners of this podcast. Visit percivalconstantine.com/DFK or click the link in the show notes. Fill out the form and then get 2 free novels and 1 free superhero short story. The novels are Vanguard, Heroes Forged, an Avengers-inspired team of superheroes, and Ronin Born, a cyberpunk superhero novel set in a futuristic, fascist Japan. The short story is Omega Knights, Fire and Lightning, a Power Rangers-inspired prequel to an upcoming serial. Take advantage of this offer today, and be sure to catch Superhero Cinephiles on all major podcast platforms. Filmmakers and movie fans alike should be sure to attend these film festivals: Brightside Tavern in Jersey City, Hang On to Your Shorts in Asbury Park, Point Lookout on Long Island, and Round Reel in Bloomfield, New Jersey. Take it from an alum of 2 of them. Submission information for filmmakers, as well as details about the festivals, can be found at filmfreeway.com. Follow the festivals on social media for news about events, discounts, tickets, and more. Also, listen to the Hang On to Your Shorts and Cullen on Film podcasts, available via a shared universe network. So, when I started talking about Superboy, the little saga cell, the little intro at the beginning of the episodes, I mentioned how he's been erased from continuity twice. Right, and the first one, obviously, we've spoken a lot about was our shift from pre-crisis to post-crisis. And then following Infinite Crisis, we get this reintroduction, which we've been talking about over these past few episodes. But then, right, so Secret Origin ends in 2010, and then like a year later, we get the New 52. We get Flashpoint and the New 52. And in the New 52 continuity, Clark was not Superboy. So it was out of continuity once again. Do you ever remember thinking about that fact that Superboy had once again been erased, or anyone ever bringing it up at the shop? I'm curious, like, if that ever, again, crossed your mind or popped up in conversation.
No, nobody brought that up. It didn't mention it. I don't know if its impact was truly noticed. I think for me, it was the thing that I cared about the most, where I was like, oh no, was the loss of the Kents. I didn't like that. I am one of those people that the Kents need to be alive. We got to go home to Smallville from time to time. We got to have Thanksgiving. Maybe Batman shows up. They got to be there. Versus like, oh, they were, they died a long time ago, which is how it is, and I guess in most continuities, right? But being a 90s DC Comics reader, I like knowing that they were there, because most other characters, Peter Parker didn't really have fully that. Batman definitely didn't have that. Very few characters had that. A family to, return to from time to time, or assistance, or just to have some downtime. So when they were eliminated in the way they were, didn't like that. That never sat well with me.
You're preaching to the choir here. I know, I agree. I think that, I don't know. Again, audience, like if, I would be curious to hear your experience with this, because I feel like Superboy being erased again was not really part of the conversation at the time with the New 52. I think the marriage to Lois being gone and the Kents being dead, I think those were the big things that people, myself included, really fixated on. And I think they definitely loom larger over the proceedings. And also the fact that Clark as Superboy in the years prior, again, like we're talking about here, was only really utilized in relatively limited respects. So I think that's why it probably wasn't a bigger part of the conversation. But during the New 52, right, Superboy is gone. I should also mention, though, I'm going to backtrack just a second here, but in the midst of all of this, not an in-continuity story, but All-Star Superman, right, published from 2005 to 2008, though I don't think, if memory serves, he's never explicitly called Superboy, but clearly the issue where Pa passes, he's Superboy in that. He's a much younger Clark. He's studying journalism. He's home visiting. He's playing with crypto. Like, he's Superboy in that. So another instance where, like, this version of the character lived.
It did, but then All-Star Superman really is, it embraced a lot of classic Superman tropes, 1970s type of adventures, and a little splash, not a pinch, but a splash of Silver Age. It embraced all of that stuff.
Totally.
So for him to, be depicted even for one panel is, yeah, he was Superboy. That fits into that unique mixture. That's an isolated story.
So we're in the New 52 era. Then we enter Rebirth. And we get to this Reborn storyline in 2017, where the post-crisis Superman and the New 52 Superman, the characters and their histories and continuities are merged.
And that was complicated.
It was very complicated. And immediately after that, there was a two-parter in Action Comics from Dan Jurgens that showed Superman going to the fortress and having Helix like play his life back to him, essentially, because like he knows that things have changed and something feels off, and so he wants to kind of go through his new history. And at this point in time, the Kents are still dead. I mean, I would say the vast like majority of post-crisis continuity was once again intact, but the Kents were dead. And he wasn't ever Superboy. And it's interesting because there's a page in particular that stands out where it's like right out of Secret Origin. Like the Clark and Lana, and like they look just like the iterations we saw in Secret Origin, and Clark is in his blue shirt and red jacket, but there's no mention of Superboy. So we had almost a moment where he could have come back, but clearly there was a decision there to not go that far at that point. And then we get to Doomsday Clock. And I know you had a chance to take a look at that last issue.
Absolutely did.
Let me just ask you, just general. I mean, we did a whole episode on it, and it's its own thing. But just big picture, your take on Doomsday Clock. Were you into it? Because I know people are very split on this.
The fact that it was such a love letter to the concept of Superman and what it means to DC brand comics, that makes it all worthwhile. That makes the new Rorschach and the marionette and mime characters, and makes all of that stuff worthwhile, because it was such this is the value of Superman story, to where he is even able to convince the cold and emotionless Dr. Manhattan himself that maybe you could do better than this. That made it all worthwhile. And certainly when you get when it went out of its way, and I would love to know some behind the scenes, like how does Geoff Johns really feel about certain things? Which I've had opportunities to ask, but I never think of questions at the time. Which was it not Geoff Johns that killed off Jonathan Kent? Did he not do that?
He did. And Brainiac.
Yeah, I thought he did that. But then, we're revisiting the value of that character. Not that he was not valuable, but we're really reconnecting with that in Secret Origin. And then in Doomsday Clock, Geoff Johns, he did not have to do this. He did not have to do this. But he restored the Kents. There's a moment of intervention during the car accident they perished in, and they were saved. They were back. He did do that. And when I read that moment, which I was not expecting, not to spoil anything, because there's so much other stuff going on in editorial context for why things were happening at that time in the DC universe, but I thought that made the whole thing worthwhile. Like, hey, they fixed that.
When you get to that panel of him embracing Jonathan and Martha, I'm like, that's what this was all for, man. And it was worth it. I remain a fan of Doomsday Clock, and I reread the final issue, and it's a relatively small list of comics that they always elicit a strong emotional reaction. Like I tear up, man. And that happens a few times in Doomsday Clock, especially when we get to Dr. Manhattan's meditation on Superman.
Yeah,
and this fundamental takeaway that the rocket arrives, a child is loved, Superman is made. We spend a lot of time on this show, and fans spend we pick apart so many aspects of this, but at its most absolute core, right? This idea, the rocket arrives, a child is loved, Superman is made. I love it. I love it so much. And in the context of our Superboy discussion here, what we find out in Doomsday Clock is that Dr. Manhattan had manipulated the history of the DC universe.
Because he's fascinated by DC. He's like, what is this place? He literally discovers DC Comics. Says, what is this? This is crazy. Well, what happens if this guy becomes Alan Scott becomes the first Green Lantern? Well, what if he doesn't get the lantern? Then what do we have? Or what if this happens over here to this character? This is utterly fascinating.
Right.
What do we get here if I make these changes? This is so weird and interesting to me. But continue.
Yeah. Well, so what we find out is that there's no JSA in the New 52 mainline DC universe, or there hadn't been, or in the Rebirth era, because
there wasn't.
Because Dr. Manhattan had moved the lantern out of Alan Scott's reach, and in that train accident, Alan Scott died. And absent the Justice Society existing, Clark Kent is not inspired to become Superboy. And absent Superboy, Jonathan and Martha perish in this car accident on Clark's prom night. And absent Superboy, he's not there to inspire the Legion of Superheroes in the future, who we also don't have during this period of time in the mainline DC. Right, not properly. And through the course of the story, we do have this moment where it's all been building to this confrontation where, Manhattan doesn't see past a certain point. It's just darkness. And he assumes the last thing he sees is Superman coming at him, and he assumes that Superman kills him or vice versa. And then when we finally get to that moment in the story, Superman actually punches someone behind Manhattan, and he's like, you assume it's one of these two things, but Superman rejects that binary choice. And he's like, well, what if there's nothing that you see beyond this, because it takes everything you have to save this world? And that kind of unlocks everything for Osterman. And then he starts to put things right. And we see this moment play out both times, where Clark is in the car being dropped off at the prom by Jonathan and Martha. And in the first version, when Alan Scott never became Green Lantern and we never had the Justice Society, Jonathan is like, nobody's ever seen someone like you, Clark. They'll be afraid. Like, you can't show people what you can do. Then, after the Lantern has been put into place and Alan Scott becomes Green Lantern and the Justice Society exists, the conversation now shifts. And now we revisit that moment, and Jonathan's like, they've seen people like you before, Clark. Embrace who you are. Show them what you can do. And then in this moment of the car accident, we have them, Jonathan and Martha, saved by Clark in his Superboy garb. And so what I think, it's funny, I talked about in Secret Origin, I don't know that there's as much new to say there, but I think where Johns has the most interesting thing to say about Superboy specifically, I feel like it comes in Doomsday Clock, where he makes Superboy this fulcrum point for the entire history of the DC universe. It's like the Justice Society inspires Superboy. Superboy then in turn inspires the Legion, and Superboy becomes like this nexus, this bridge between the past and the future of the entire DC universe. And also seemingly is the difference between Jonathan and Martha living or dying that night. How did you feel about all that?
But just what you said is what I love about DC Comics. This connection from the past, the Justice Society, to this thing here, to this thing in the future. I've always said that the DC uniquely has three great houses. The Justice Society, Justice League, and the Legion of Superheroes. And even they don't realize that they understate that way too much. That's something, Marvel doesn't really have that. They really don't, probably never will. They would have forever ago if they were going to. That's something unique about DC. And I think that that whole instance was very meta in that there's hundreds of characters, from the 1940s that didn't last, never came back. They couldn't, you can probably count on two hands the characters from that time period that are still active or had any type of connection with the public in a big way. Superman's one of those characters. Like, what's so special about this character? And when you've got Manhattan analyzing this, what is it with this character? I changed this. You still get something. I did this over here. You still get something. What is this? I don't understand. Who is this person? How can this be? This character, this person can be that important? Because he is. In the universe and also in our real world. Superman is a very unique character. So that was to see that's what this story was. Doomsday Clock was big and it was loud and there was a lot of marketing and variant covers and action figures. But to see that that's what this story was really all about, fantastic.
No, I agree. And, as we get towards the conclusion of number 12, right, this discussion about how the metaverse exists to preserve every era of Superman. So every time continuity changes, a new Earth in the multiverse is created to preserve that. So now that we're out of the New 52 era, Earth 52 exists out there. Yeah, I loved it. And as far as the Superboy piece of it, it gave a level of importance to Superboy existing, both in terms of Clark's personal life, the survival of his parents, but also again, this entire lineage of the DC universe. So it's not that we have to assign that sort of importance or reason to Clark being Superboy. I mean, I think a reason why Clark becomes Superman, or a way in which Clark learns to become Superman, is by being Superboy. I think that is an interpretation that can work. That's enough. But I really did kind of appreciate the larger meaning behind it. Now, why he had to be Superboy in order to save Jonathan and Martha, I don't know. I'm a little mixed on that, but maybe it's like he was out patrolling, right? And he wouldn't have been patrolling if he weren't Superboy, right? Because I would like to think he would, if he knew that this, and again, the fact that it was the spur of the moment accident, it does kind of, I'm headcanoning this, right? Like, it does kind of lead me to believe, like, maybe this was something where he was on patrol and then he happened to, although it was his prom night, so I don't know how that works. But in any event, that ended up being the difference. So, yeah, I really appreciated Doomsday Clock as a whole, and especially what it had to say about Superboy. And then past that, to my knowledge, the only other glimpse we've had in the first issue of the Joshua Williamson Superman series, which is still ongoing, there's a double-page spread at the beginning of the issue that kind of shows these like glimpses of Clark's life. And there's like, I'm talking like one little shard, one little panel that shows what appears to be a Superboy for a moment there. So again, my understanding is, though, it hasn't really been explored in these years, really, since Secret Origin, to be honest. Like, that is a part of his past.
How about this? Does Superman Secret Origin read well with Doomsday Clock? Did they read well together in one sitting? That's
hard to say. And I didn't reread all of Doomsday Clock for this. I just went through the most salient parts of number 12. So I don't know that I can.
But, creatively, you've got the same creative team.
Yeah.
Boy is a factor that sometimes I wonder if you're reading Doomsday Clock alone. Maybe you read Watchmen, that's it. You read no other DC comics. Does that moment really land? Does that moment versus like the big picture of the whole storyline, does that moment land the same as it would if you had interacted with Secret Origin? Specifically Secret Origin.
Yeah, that's a good question. It would be an interesting experiment. I think there's something to that, especially that they're the same creative team and the fact the crucial role that Superboy ends up playing, which, the first time I read Doomsday Clock, and probably even the second time I read Doomsday Clock, I at best was mixed about the fact that Clark being Superboy was so fundamental to Martha and Jonathan surviving and to just this entire history of the DC universe. Like, that was not really something that I was on board with at the time, but now
I could see that. Absolutely. You're like, why? Or you could say to yourself, did he have to be in costume for that moment to land?
Right. We had another patron question here as we wind down. This is from our pal, Brian Dempsey. Brian says, listening to your ongoing Superboy discussions prompted me to look and see if DC did in fact relaunch Legion after Superboy was reinstated. I was very surprised to find out they did. It launched in 2010, and the solicitations reference it as a tie-in to the Geoff Johns Legion story in the main Superman book. I also read the solicitations for each issue, and it doesn't appear Superboy was used in any of the 16 issues the series lasted. So just for a second here, we've mentioned this a couple of times, and I really wasn't aware of it until Brian keyed me in on it. But it was this Paul Levitt's written Legion series, and the solicitation does reference the John stuff, but it doesn't have that actual connection in the series as far as I know. Did you ever read this?
It seems like there's still at that point somebody in editorial that's like, no, you can have your Legion, but this story was an anomaly. Johns wanted to do it. We did it. It's over. No Superboy in Legion.
Yeah.
And then even, flashing forward to recent times, when Bendis was doing Superman, you got John Kent being the Superboy of the Legion. And I guess that's not to say Clark Kent didn't do that with his version of the Legion, but man, that's getting into some, multiversal stories of who knows what happened.
I know. But this Paul Levitt's Legion series that lasted for 16 issues right before the New 50. Do you remember that? Did you read it?
I remember it, and I tried. I couldn't do anything with it.
Fair enough.
I tried real hard.
So returning to Brian's question, he says, you've mentioned a few times that DC failed to capitalize on Superboy, and the evidence seems to imply you're correct. My question, if you were in charge of DC, or at least an influential group editor there, what would you have done with Superboy, taking into account the DC universe of the time, like 2010, 2011? Curious what your guest on the episode would do as well. Brian says, I would have launched the Superboy Monthly where we explore Clark's years in Smallville. The Smallville TV series had just wrapped, and we could have really filled the vacuum that season 11 didn't hit for some fans, though I enjoyed it. It may have hit a sweet spot for fans sorry to see the show go, plus we would have had Flights and Tights. What do you think about that?
I think that you would have had to have a powerful creative team and a consistent creative team to do that. because simply, Untold Tales of Superman as a Boy on the monthly shelf with all the other competing titles, including a Superman title, Action Comics title, you would have to have a powerful, not necessarily established, but you'd have to have a powerful creative team to make that title successful. But it was absolutely there. Editorially, you open the doorway, nobody walked through.
Absolutely. I mean, you look at, not that it had to be Johns himself, but if it had been Johns, like if it had been, I enjoyed the Boy of Steel arc that Johns and Manapul did with Connor, but if it had been Clark, right? Instead, if you had those two powerhouse creators, right? Whether in Adventure Comics or a separate series featuring Clark as Superboy, maybe that would have gotten some eyeballs on it and, would have gotten the green light from DC. I don't know. But yeah, I mean, I think to reinstate this aspect and then just kind of like leave it there. And look, to Johns' credit, I mean, he had the whole, like we spent 2.5 hours last week talking about the Legion trilogy that he did. They weren't the Smallville set stories that resonate most with me, but it's like he did work with the concept of Clark as Superboy and the impact that it had on Clark's life. But I don't know if there was just not an appetite from anyone else or, nothing that DC was interested in pursuing. Like, I don't know, but something like what Brian is proposing, I think could have been interesting. Now, for 2 issues out of a 6-issue miniseries, the idea that Clark is Superboy in secret and no one knows and he's the suburban myth, that's fine. I mean, if were you to do a sustained, or longer miniseries or an ongoing and he only ever operates in secret, I don't know. It would be interesting. I think that'd be a little challenging, but I don't know. I'd be curious to see it.
Almost wonder, because you only got 2 issues of Superboy, you almost wonder if Secret Origin was supposed to be a Man of Steel, sort of, or maybe it started in a manner of Clark arriving in the city, and maybe the whole Superboy was like a tacked on, like, come on, guys, I really want to, can I bring Superboy back? Can I do that in my story? Fine, you got 2 issues, then don't talk about it anymore.
Maybe.
It's uncommonly disjointed for a Geoff Johns story, is it not?
Yes, it really is.
I think this was too little, too late in 2009. And now I really do wonder if, because we only got 2 issues of Superboy in Smallville out of our 6, if that was just something to accommodate Geoff Johns for this brief period of time, and then let him get it out of his system, then he doesn't have to ask us about this anymore. Maybe that's what this was.
I don't know, but we've been talking about Superboy on this podcast for many, many episodes now, and I genuinely feel like we've manifested certain things over the years. So all this talk about Superboy, I'd be curious to see in the future what if anything might pop up. I guess we'll have to stay tuned and see. But a couple of things. Number one, our Superboy coverage is not done. Next week, we're going to circle back to the 1960s and have a discussion on the complete series of Filmation Superboy cartoons. Previously, we looked at a little selection of them. Now we're going to go through all 34. So people don't want to miss that. In lieu of a skip week for Labor Day week, I decided to do this special on the Filmation Superboy cartoons. And then the week after that, we are launching into the final act of a Superboy fan journey, aka The Trials of Smallville, a 7-episode look back at my beloved Smallville, my favorite adaptation of the character. So I'm so excited. I hope people keep tuning in. But these discussions of the origin, I mean, there's always a lot to unpack here, and so I appreciate your time and your insight. And what would you like people to know about Acme Comics?
We've been open since 1983. You can check out our website to see what new releases are going to be, either from us or if wherever you shop, you can see what new releases are. You can find us on Instagram. If you're ever passing through Greensboro, North Carolina, which many people do, for different events, sporting events, various things, it always surprises me. It doesn't when someone, has seen my Comic Shop Country documentary or listens to, one of your many shows, and they stop in and they say, "Hey, are you that guy that was on the podcast with Anthony?" I was like, "Yeah, that was me." That's always fun. And, also I'm primarily known as being a Marvel guy, and I am a Marvel guy, but I can do this too. I can do some DC stuff too, with the best of them.
Right on. and you're known for your hot takes and your crystal clear feelings on things.
Well, hopefully you got that. I appreciated Superman Secret Origin. I did like the story. And when I didn't like it, came back around on it.
Right on. Right on. This is, again, the most, I think objective assessment I've been able to give it in its proper context. And I found it to be a very, kind of valuable journey and process. And I hope the audience enjoyed this discussion. And again, if there's anyone listening to this who's like never read it, I mean, do give it a read. And if there are people who love it, I hope we didn't, take away from your enjoyment of it. And maybe there are those who have read it, but, it didn't really do much for them. And, maybe they'll take another look at it or whatnot. I don't know. But it was definitely a critical piece of this Superboy puzzle. I'm glad we spent the time that we did. I thank you, Jermaine. I thank you, audience. Again, next week, we'll be returning to the world of the Filmation Superboy cartoons. It's a fun one. I'm joined by Wearing the Cape cosplayer Daniel Sanchez, so don't miss that next week. And then in 2 weeks, the Trials of Smallville begin. Until then, as always, it's about what you do. It's about action. Be sure to check out our sister podcast series, Another Exciting Episode in the Adventures of Superman, an episode-by-episode breakdown of the classic George Reeves television show, available wherever you get podcasts. Please join us on social media, become a patron, and subscribe, rate, and review today. Links are in the show notes. Thank you all.